Let's talk about big Gauss cannons and Doomsday weapons with a look at Necron anti-tank and which is the best at scrapping enemy armour from long range, the Doomstalker, the Doomsday Ark or the Lokhust heavy destroyer. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Necrons once more, and in this video I thought we'd do an anti-tank contest for the units in the Codex. The Necrons do have access to rather a lot of fairly good high strength, high AP fire support pieces that often seem to crop up in the backfield of army lists, gunning down enemy armoured vehicles and monsters from a range. In general in 40k it's perhaps more important to have at least some firepower that's good against monsters and vehicles, as usually that's going to be at least somewhat effective against infantry, where in 10th edition the other way around isn't always that true. And while there are plenty of other things that can certainly kill vehicles very well, things like Catan like the Shard of the Void Dragon or the Nightbringer, or various combos like Immortals in Canoptek Court for loads of devastating wounds, or mass Lokhust destroyers with a Destroyer Lord, I feel like the actual direct anti-tank shooting options are definitely still strong options within the Necron army. I'm sure plenty of people will be continuing to use them. For this comparison I thought we could look at the Doomsday Ark, the Doomstalker, the Lokhust Heavy Destroyer and the Doom Scythe, and just take a look at their numbers and see how efficient they are for the cost when firing at a few likely vehicle targets. There've certainly been a few interesting developments out of the new Necron Codex that's changed up the status quo a little bit with this. The Doomsday Ark got a heavier gun and went up to 200 points. The Doomstalker can get some big rerolls from Canoptek Court now, which is kind of massive, and the Doom Scythe got its points and special rules tweaks, but still does remain very expensive. For this one I thought we'd go through each of them in turn and see what sort of numbers they spit out against a bunch of heavy tanks, then take a look at their durability and finish up with some closing thoughts as to which anti-tank is best. Starting out I thought we'd start with the really big gun and begin with the mighty Doomsday Ark. Definitely a model that felt rather underpowered and swingy in 9th edition, though in 10th edition it seems to have really come into its own. More reliable damage output with more guaranteed shots, the new blast keyword and a flat damage 4, and now its damage output isn't entirely ruined if it has to move around a little bit, though it is still better if it's stationary where it gets the heavy keyword and also devastating wounds via its special rule. In the Codex the Doomsday Ark got a little bit cheaper at 200 points, and for that cost you get a toughness 9 arc profile with a 3+ save and 14 wounds and a big 4+ invulnerable. It's fairly fast with a movement of 10 inches to get some lines of sight if it needs to, and the mighty Doomsday cannon spits out d6+1 shots at strength 18, AP 4 and damage 4. Really quite a mighty anti-tank weapon there, though it can definitely still swing low or high. Beyond that it does get really quite a big flurry of Gauss flare shots from the 2 arrays that it has on either side. They can help it repel threats from its own deployment zone if the enemy tries to deep strike some light infantry nearby potentially. Starting out for its damage output, these are the numbers that it spits out against a bunch of different targets. When I did this similar video for Space Marine anti-tank weapons, I thought I'd go for a few assumptions. You're firing at a target just under 24-inch range, so it does get to make use of its Gauss flares for this. And the model gets to remain stationary 1/3 of the time. I feel like that's maybe reasonable enough, as it's fairly likely on terrain-dense battlefields that you might need to redeploy if you want to get line of sight on what you need to shoot down, or you might be wanting to move towards objectives and things. The enemy also doesn't have a cover save there, though the Doomsday Ark maybe isn't the worst against things in cover given its very high AP. For targets to shoot at I thought we'd take a look at a Terminator, a Space Marine Rhino tank with some light armour, a Tyranid Maleceptor for something with a big invulnerable save, and a mighty Space Marine Land Raider. With average rolling, the Doomsday Ark takes down around about 2 Terminators, should have a very good chance of one-shotting light armour like a Rhino tank that it now wounds on a 2+ rather than a 3, and a bit more balanced against things with the better saves like the Maleceptor or the Land Raider. Usually 1 or 2 failed saves against the Maleceptor, or around about 2 on average against the Land Raider for about 8 damage. Certainly very threatening damage output overall though. You wouldn't need many shots at that profile to justify its points cost taking down heavy hitters. Next into the ring for anti-tank competitors we've got the Lokhust Heavy Destroyers though. These are the ones that can take the Gauss Destructors for this comparison. The Enmitic guns are still pretty interesting, but the Gauss is what you want for busting enemy armour. They're 50 points per model for a 4 wounds toughness 6 mounted unit that moves 8 inches, and each one gets a single shot with that scary Gauss at strength 14, AP -4 and a huge damage 6. As it's Gauss it gets lethal hits, so an extra chance for an auto wound there, and it also has the heavy keyword so it can hit on a 2+ if it's stationary. and it has the extra special rule that if you target monsters or vehicles with it, presuming you haven't auto-wounded already, you get to reroll a wound roll of 1. All very scary and very much dedicated, not that flexible anti-tank with this guy. For comparison, if we had 200 points worth of Lokhust heavy destroyers, so that will be 4 of them, it seems that these guys underperform a little bit against a Terminator kind of profile, as some of that big damage 6 is lost, but it does look for raw damage output, it seems to outperform the Doomsday Ark. Solidly better numbers against Rhino tanks, Maleceptors and Land Raiders, and out of these it pulls a bit ahead on the tougher targets, given that the Doomsday Ark does care a little bit about shooting against the Rhino, given that it wounds that on a 2+. Overall pretty scary stuff here. 4 of them average 2 wounds through failed saves against a Land Raider, so a massive 12 damage. Certainly less flexible against heavy infantry, but if you want dedicated anti-tank they do seem to spit out raw numbers, even if they do have some disadvantages like not being quite as tough, as we'll get onto in a second. Next up for comparison though, and we have the Canoptek Doomstalker. This one very much feels like the little brother of the Doomsday Ark, a fun War of the Worlds type walker with a Doomsday Blaster on top, 135 points for a single model, and a profile that really mirrors the Doomsday Ark quite a lot. It gets 12 wounds at toughness 8 with a 4+ invulnerables, so fairly tanky against heavy anti-tank fire there. Lots of wounds and a good invulnerable save are quite good for that. And the Doomsday Blaster is basically a Doomsday cannon but slims down on all stats. It only hits on a 4 or 3+ if it's stationary. Its strength is a bit decreased at strength 14, and it gets a little bit less AP and damage at AP 3 and damage 3 rather than AP 4 and damage 4. It does have a fun special rule where it gets to Overwatch on a hit roll of a 5+. Could maybe make it a little bit more of a tempting option for that if you've got them in your army, though again that's still kind of unreliable. Though if you do happen to be playing in the Canoptek Court, it does get a lot better both for its regular shooting and for Overwatch. Being able to reroll all hit rolls when you're within your power matrix is really quite big. I feel like most of the time you probably would be able to push that out to the midfield, but even if it was just locked to your own deployment zone, this guy can usually still make good use of it. Rerolling all hit rolls just flat out for free is just an enormous buff to the firepower of a fairly dangerous unit. Putting the Canoptek Doomstalker's numbers into the table, and it's interesting that it seems to stand out most against Terminators, but maybe being a bit more mediocre against the tougher vehicle targets. If it's not in the Canoptek Court, it really doesn't seem to have quite as good damage output as the Doomsday Ark, basically the same against things like Terminators, where they don't really care about the extra AP or the damage 3 versus damage 4. But then even waiting for points and the fact that you basically get about 1.5 Doomstalkers for your 200 points, it still comes out significantly further behind against all of the tough monster or vehicle targets. I guess worse hit rolls, extra AP and damage debuffs all stack up, and they do seem to outweigh the points disparity. Overall I'd say the raw damage comparison numbers maybe don't look amazing for the Doomstalker, but then if you did field it in the Canoptek Court and kept up the power matrix, that kind of flips things around. Compared with the Doomsday Ark at least, it's maybe still a little bit worse against things like Rhinos, but basically the same against the tougher vehicle targets, and stand out good against heavy infantry, killing almost 3 Terminators on average per 200 points worth of model. Basically overall, between all that for damage output alone, it seems like the Doomstalker seems to lose out to the first 2 options outside of Canoptek Court, but in Canoptek Court that seems to be enough to allow it to catch up, at least in context of its durability, and it might also get some other support stratagems on offer to it as well. Finally, for units, just in case we hadn't had quite enough Doom things, I thought it would also include the Doom Scythe as well. The Necron Flyer packing the almighty Heavy Death Ray and the Tesla Destructor. The Doom Scythe is the most expensive out of any of these options at 230 points, and for that you get a flyer with toughness 9 and 12 wounds, and as a flyer it does need to start off the board unfortunately, so you can only get this damage output from turn 2 earliest, and then you get a locked flight path depending on where you've pointed the model. For its main event with the anti-tank gun, you get 3 shots at strength 16, AP -4 and damage D6 +1. And you get that with sustained hits D3 as well, so 6 is a really quite good news for it. Then it backs that up with a Tesla Destructor, which should be good for stacking at least a few AP0 damage 2 saves on virtually anything. Better against lighter infantry, but could certainly put a couple more wounds on vehicles. And its special rule gives the opponent the choice between taking a -1 to hit debuff next turn, or allowing the Death Ray to get the critical hits with the sustained hits D3 on a 5+, not a 6, which is something that people might have to genuinely weigh up. If it's shooting something big and important, you might genuinely not want it to have a -1 to hit next turn, as that could cost you a lot of damage. Out of these ones, the Doom Scythe is generally seen as the most underwhelming out of the choices, but to be honest its actual damage numbers really stack up kind of fine. It's pretty similar to the Doomsday Ark, a bit worse against Terminators, kind of the same against the Rhino targets, and then a little bit better against the Land Raider and the Maleceptor in particular. I think it's actually the Tesla Destructor wounds that help it pull ahead against the Maleceptor, as they don't really care about its big invulnerable save. For these numbers I've gone with the rough and ready approach of opponents using the stand firm half the time to avoid the -1 to hit debuff. They do help out its numbers a tiny bit, but even if they chose the -1 to hit every single time, it wouldn't really be numbers too far from this. It definitely feels like it's got disadvantages compared with the rest though. I guess it would get fairly guaranteed good line of sight on the turn that it came in, but not shooting turn 1 and limited flexibility after that are a couple of big disadvantages for it. I'd say for these guys and dedicated anti-tank, the damage output is probably the most important thing, though I think durability is definitely worth bearing in mind. If they're duking it out with other enemy heavy hitters, how many hits they can take before they fall flat is kind of important. Here are the numbers for the amount of hits they can take with a few different heavy weapons, as overcharged plasma at strength 8 damage 2, a strength 10 missile launcher and a las cannon profile, and these are the numbers of hits needed on average to take down 200 points worth of the unit. Out of these ones I feel like there's a couple of clear winners here. The Doomsday Ark and the Doomstalker with their big 4+ invulnerable saves and high wound counts tend to do well. The Doomsday Ark is a bit tougher against smaller arms fire, where things like overcharged plasma wounded on a 5+ being toughness 9, whereas they're wounded on a 4 for the Doomstalker. And the Doomstalkers kind of stand out against dedicated anti-tank fire, where it's still going to be wounded on a 3+, even if it's against lat cannons, but it gets lots of wounds for the cost with 4+ invulnerable saves. The Lokhust heavies are kind of tough against the missile launcher profile, and that'll go up a bit if it gets cover, which is a bit more meaningful for it than for the things with the big invulnerables. They are very fragile to overcharged plasma and melter and other things with mid-strength and high AP though, and otherwise the Doomsday is just kind of bad all the way around and very significantly so. It's around about twice as easy to kill a Doomsday as it is a Doomsday Ark given the lack of the invulnerable save and how many points it has for its wounds. I feel like this more than anything is probably the main reason that people choose not to take them. It can hit solidly hard on the turn that it comes in, but then if the opponent's got any long-range anti-tank guns, it's going to be fairly easy to remove compared with just about anything else in the army. Overall though, between all that, I feel like there's some good arguments that you could make for most of them. The Doomsday Ark's just a strong all-rounder, really quite tough, and generally dangerous for the cost, plus compared with the other two it's a bit faster, and those gas flare arrays are some genuinely okay anti-infantry type shooting to repel things that get too close to it. The Lokhust heavy destroyers do have the best dedicated anti-tank damage output, seeing as they're the most focused, and also have the disadvantage of being a bit easier to kill with mid-strength sort of things, and the big individual Gauss shots aren't going to help as much against heavy infantry, not compared with the blast weapons. The Doomstalker I think is kind of interesting. It's probably on balance the most durable, particularly against heavy anti-tank fire, but its damage output is kind of lackluster against enemy heavy hitters itself unless it's in Canoptek Court. It needs the Canoptek Court rerolls to compete with anti-tank damage with the Doomsday Ark, though it does put it significantly ahead against heavy infantry, which is kind of big. I think I'd be a bit more tempted by Doomsday Arks outside of Canoptek Court, but the Doomstalkers do seem to win out within, particularly with access to other stratagems and buffs if you want them. Otherwise, perhaps as suspected, I feel like the Doom Scythe is just a bit behind the rest. Its damage output is honestly fine, but with fly disadvantages and being able to be shot down quite so easily the next turn, I feel like you're probably going to be better off with one of the rest. Having seen the numbers on the damage though, I feel like it's maybe not quite as far behind as I might have guessed otherwise. Let me know your thoughts though. Which anti-tank weapons will you be using in Codex Necrons yourself? Would you be picking up some of the heavy anti-tank fire support for behind the lines? Or is it Wraiths, Immortals and Catan Shards all the way? Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments, and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll hope to keep a few more Necron videos coming over the next few weeks. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.